Hello and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green. This is going to be a contextualized reading lecture on Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. It's part of a larger series that I've been doing for a few years now, where I walk through act by act, just the reading and context of Shakespeare plays. It's usually meant for early university students who have limited experience or prior experience with Shakespeare, who might have difficulty with the language itself. Um, and it's meant to sort of highlight more of the cultural background, literary background of the text. It is not necessarily going to be helpful for folks who are looking to get scholarly coverage of the various historical presentations and stagings of the play itself. So I'm not making this for potential actors. I mean, you might get something out of it if you want, but that's not my scope here. I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Move this bar out of the way, which you can't see. So as I get started, I'm generally drawing on the ardent Shakespeare here, so I want to give particular credit to Keir Elam, who edited this edition. I'll inflect stuff with some other thoughts and folks, particularly from Stephen Greenblatt, as we go along, but just the bulk of what I'm doing is sort of here's walking through the 150-page introduction to this. So if you're one of my students and you're taking this for a class, you can kind of watch this lecture video to get a grounding before we enter the text, and then you can kind of cut out 150 pages of reading if you like. So not going to do a whole bunch of biographical stuff on William Shakespeare, just very basic things. Born in 1564, dies in 1616. This is a comedy, so I want to situate the play as a comedy as opposed to a tragedy. And if we think about Shakespeare and his writing career, he really, explodes on the scene in London in the 1590s. And so we might think of this play as kind of a mid-career play. He's definitely come into his maturity as a writer. We also know, and I have some earlier lectures on A Midsummer Night's Dream, that Shakespeare was interested in genre conventions. So he was particularly interested with A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet, which are written around the same time in the mid 1590s. He's interested in dealing with the same sort of plot and characterization or similarities, but having one play go the tragic route and one play go the comedic route. So we know that that's something that he's already done before. And so that's important, I think, when we think about Twelfth Night, because it's written right around the same time that Hamlet, the tragedy, is written. So we'll say more about that in a few minutes, but let's just think a little bit very broadly about what comedies are. So comedies generally have happy endings that frequently end with marriages. Tragedies do not have happy endings, and they frequently end with death. This play has elements of farce, and so according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, farce is a comedic dramatic piece that uses highly improbable situations, stereotyped characters, extravagant exaggeration, and violent horseplay. The term also refers to the class or form of drama made up of such compositions. farce is generally regarded as intellectually and aesthetically inferior to comedy in its crude characterizations and implausible plots, but it has been sustained by its popularity and performance and has persisted throughout the Western world to the present. So if we're going, I think that there are elements of farce in the play, but I don't know if we would quite call Twelfth Night a farce, because Shakespeare has this ability to take the playfulness, the comedic elements, and really, really push them to the moment where we've had too much fun, where we've gone too far in this play. And so this play is definitely actively working with borders, with limitations. There's cross-dressing, conceptual categories, class categories, which are throughout Shakespeare's career. He's writing about people from different layers of a class and hierarchical society. Twelfth Night is the last in a series of comedies that he developed in the 1590s. And it comes at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. It's the last romantic and cross-dressing comedy, which included earlier plays such as You Like It, Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Merchant, and The Merchant of Venice. It is the first of several dark comedies that will eventually show a shift in themes for 17th century drama more generally. It's written generally around the time of Hamlet, as I said, and will be followed quickly by dark plays such as King Lear and Macbeth. In a first reading of the play, then, I think we want to be particularly attentive to various reversals in the play. We want to also think about jesters and fools and their roles here, particularly in their ability to proceed with a kind of freedom of speech. Why? Why think about freedom of speech in the early 1600s when this play is being written? Well, with the end of Elizabeth's life and the coming succession, English folks were concerned about political transition, especially as it related to religion. So we have to talk about religion a little bit here. And a lot of times my students don't come with a lot of background about religion. So if you know a lot about this stuff, it might seem like duh for a minute, but some of my students don't, and that's what these contextualized readings are for. So I don't assume that my students know that much about Christianity, for example. My students in contemporary U.S. classrooms need to be aware that there was no such thing during Shakespeare's time as a separation between church and state. The state church was Protestant. It was called and is today called the Anglican Church, and attendance was mandatory at the time, though not today. Housing or harboring a Catholic priest during Shakespeare's period was a crime punishable by death. So there's a lot of religious violence that's been going on, not just in England, but over across the way on the continent. This has been following a broader shift in Christianity that has rumblings for a while before it erupts, but it erupts around 1517 with a man named Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. Who famously nails his 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. If you read Shakespeare, you will note that Hamlet is studying at Wittenberg in Germany, and he's come back home to Denmark to attend his father's funeral. And so what we read historically into Hamlet is a kind of ambiguity about what his theological beliefs are at the time. So there's a lot of historical tension going on, and it definitely shifts the way you might read the play of Hamlet. Again, Hamlet is written like really close to the same time as Twelfth Night. So we want to think about them in close proximity here. The famous Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt notes that Shakespeare's father kept Catholic paraphernalia hidden. And this, among other things in his play and life, suggests that Shakespeare himself maybe had Catholic leanings. And this is scholarship that came out way, way after Shakespeare's death. So he was already a popularized writer in English imagination. Greenblatt also notes, and this is in his great book, Will in the World, like it doesn't seem like Shakespeare himself was that concerned about leaving a legacy of his plays in print. He wasn't concerned in having them published so much after his death. He'd become quite wealthy by the end of his life, and he'd been able to, in some ways, kind of buy himself into nobility. That act is made fun of in Twelfth Night, so he may be very well poking fun at his own self. And it's important for us to understand that. And I think it's important because some people, put Shakespeare into a category of just general white male authors, for example, which is something that is in the contours of our present society, is something that I think that we should critique. We should also be aware that in terms of Shakespeare's own time, like Shakespeare did not seem to want to think of himself as immortal, or as this grand bard of England. And so that's something that has come by interpretation and criticism and celebration of Shakespeare's work much, much later after his death, and something that I think that we should consider as well. Do I want to say anything else about that? No, not right now. So, if Shakespeare did have Catholic leanings, it definitely makes us think a little bit differently about possible interpretations for the play, but also, as any English 101 or English Literature 101 class will ask you to think about, is like, to what extent does an author's intentions inflect or carry over necessarily into how we might interpret their works. So in some classrooms and some literary ways of thinking, we have this thing called the author fallacy, which says it doesn't matter what the author thought. What matters is the text itself. In terms of literary criticism, that is sometimes called new criticism. New criticism is not new. It's a way of reading that develops in the early 20th century, especially in the United States. It tries to emphasize a democratic way into a text. So it doesn't assume that students know Latin or know other languages, or have had a classical education. So it doesn't assume that students know the allusions to the Roman poet Ovid that are, just throughout Shakespeare's language. And so when we're treating the text, just the text itself, in a new critical way, we teach it as a kind of art object that's separate. The approach that I draw on for these lectures, and one of the reasons why I'm giving the contextualized reading lectures, is what Stephen Greenblatt calls cultural poetics. Other people call it new historicism. So it is about situating a text in its historical moment. But Greenblatt himself pushed away at times from that the categorization of new historicism. So I will use his term cultural poetics, which is about saying that no, I think that to understand and really get more out of the text, we need to understand some contextual things about when it was created, about what was going on historically, about regional differences, about class differences between characters at the time itself. So it's a later theory that develops maybe the late 80s and into the 90s and present today. So that's my own perspective in these contextualized readings, and probably why I refer to Stephen Greenblatt a lot. So let's think about some historical context. For Twelfth Night, Queen Elizabeth lives from 1533 to 1603. She reigns from 1558 until 1603, when the throne is taken over by James the First. James the First is also called James the Sixth because he was James the Sixth of Scotland. But when he becomes King of England, he's the first English king named James. So we need to understand that there's a unification of Scotland and England going on politically, with the new king coming into power as well. So a big concern at the time was with the political transition from uh, uh, towards James the First, who, of course, everybody knew he was set to replace Elizabeth. But the concern was that he might be a closet Catholic. Why? Well, his mother, whose name was Mary Queen of Scots, had been a Catholic, and Elizabeth had executed Mary Queen of Scots in 1587 on the grounds that she was plotting to take the English throne. Now, many Catholics in England and Scotland saw Mary, who was a great granddaughter of Henry VII. That would be Elizabeth's grandfather. A lot of Catholics in England and Scotland saw Mary as the rightful heir to the throne. Mary had been forced to abdicate from the Scottish throne or give it up in 1567 when her son James was only a year old, making him James the Sixth of Scotland. So what do we want to think about here? Well, one, James didn't have a close relationship with his own mother. He became king when he was 1 year old, and she went into hiding, basically. Eventually, so she at first she runs to down to England and seeks refuge from Elizabeth, but then politics sort of change, and it seems that she's been plotting to take the throne from Elizabeth, who then executes her. Now, there's a lot more to that story that I'm not going to go into here, but this is worth digging into. Trumped up charges, things like that. But definitely, the rule of England is something that's of big concern politically. In the moment. What else do I want to say? As many students will have guessed, so Elizabeth's father is Henry VIII. Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in Italy, and this can be seen as part of the Protestant Reformation, although that's a movement that's going on all throughout Europe at the time. Henry VIII, as many of my students will know, had many wives. He was seeking a male issue. Elizabeth doesn't come to power right after him. So there's a contested throne very briefly between Lady Jane and Edward, who doesn't live very long. And then there's Elizabeth's older sister, Queen Mary. And so sometimes called Bloody Mary. So think of it this way. Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, shifted England and broke away from the Catholic Church as part of the Protestant Reformation. He founds what will become the Anglican Church, or the English Church. When Mary comes into power, Mary's Catholic, and she wants to shift England back towards Rome, back towards Catholicism. When Elizabeth comes in, she's theologically Protestant. So Mary doesn't reign for very long, and then Queen Elizabeth comes in and reigns from 1558 to 1603. She keeps a peaceful reign. She never takes a formal husband, and so she's sometimes known as the Virgin Queen. And that stability that she gives in terms of political reign in England is partly what makes her famous. And in order keep herself in power, she sometimes had to, of course, be ruthless. So there had been relative peace in England, although with very harsh laws, like you get executed if you harbor a Catholic priest. And that is possibly going to crumble with James coming into power. So the question of what James's actual theology was is really, really important to English people, but it's also kind of, people are anxious about it. Has he been hiding his Catholicism all along? Now we know historically that no, he comes into power and he maintains Protestantism, and he starts the project that will become the King James Bible, but that's not published till 1611. So that's a lot later, almost a decade later than the play that we're reading for our purposes right now. So to make a long story short, addressing religious issues publicly in England at the time was really risky business. And this is why, again, jesters or fools are so important, because they have a degree of freedom of speech. They're allowed to criticize the people in power and to criticize the royalty, for example, harshly. Like it's expected that they're going to be harsh. So the main fool or jester in this play is going to be Fest, and he oftentimes directly criticizes the arbitrariness of tyrannical power. And there's a way that he speaks to the anxieties of the English people and audiences as they know a transition of power is coming soon. The Protestant movement, as I said, is going on throughout Europe. And there are more extreme Protestant reformers than Henry VIII. We know them as Puritans or nonconformists. So the name nonconformist means that they're not conforming to the Anglican Church. Puritans were especially critical of the theater in general. They saw it as morally degenerate for society. And eventually, when they get into power later in the 1600s, after during the English Civil War, they ban plays for a while. So when plays come back to the stage with the restoration of the throne and the monarchy and Charles II, then there's a return. There's a whole kind of renaissance of play and stage acting that happens later on. The play's initial reception seems to have been enthusiastic. It was commissioned multiple times on multiple occasions by both James I and his son Charles I. It returned to the stage immediately after the restoration, and a famous diarist in England named Samuel Pepys records seeing it on multiple occasions, even though he doesn't seem to have liked the play itself. After an initial revival with the restoration of drama, the play seems to have fallen out of favor and seemed silly. I think that it's possible that its silliness, or its seemingly silliness, comes from a Puritan influence that was left over after the English Civil War. Remember, plays have been banned from the stage, but also especially plays like Twelfth Night, which hint at all sorts of Catholic festivals and Carnival, and also pagan festivals. So popularity with the play begins to revive after the mid-1700s. The play has two possible titles: Twelfth Night or What You Will. Let's just stay with Twelfth Night for a second here. So the first title refers to the 12th night after Christmas, which Christians celebrate as Jesus's birthday. Jesus is their savior. So it's also known as Epiphany or King's Day. It celebrates a story from from the New Testament. Celebrating the three wise men, or the Magi, which come and they've seen this star of Bethlehem that they've been following, and they've been following it to see their Messiah, who is born. So there have been potentates. There have been the stars in the ancient world have predicted that this great event is going to happen. When the three wise men show up, or the magi show up and see the baby Jesus, they bring him gifts. And so that's where the gifting element comes. Even today, King's Day is celebrated in a lot of different ways. If you're in France, for example, it's more, it's a bigger celebration than the way December 25th is celebrated in the United States. Oftentimes people will bake cakes. There will be, a little crown or a bean or sometimes in the cake. Whoever gets the bean in the cake becomes king for a day. It's also celebrated by Orthodox Christians as Orthodox Christmas. And oftentimes it's the biggest celebration of the holiday season or of Christmas tide. So general festival time, holiday time. Around Christmas. So because during Shakespeare's time, they were using the Julian calendar, New Year's was celebrated in March 25th, with the coming of spring. Makes sense. England adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752. So we want to think a little bit about calendars here and thinking about the Christian liturgical calendar. I'm sorry, this might be a little bit blurry on your screen, but I think I pulled it just from like Wikipedia or something, which is fine for our purposes here. So if you think about Easter coming in springtime, Easter is when Christians celebrate the crucifixion and then the ascension or the rising from the grave of their Savior and what they believe, right? So that happens in the springtime. And then 50 days after that, you celebrate Pentecost, which celebrates things that happen in Acts of the Apostles, if you're reading the New Testament. And then there's ordinary time, and then Advent, which signals the coming of Christmas time. Then there's Christmas time itself and Epiphany. Then there's another swath of ordinary time that leads up to Lent. So Lent for Christians mimics when their Savior Christ is in the desert for 40 days and he's going without food and water. So this is a time when people deprive themselves of things. Muslim folks have Ramadan, which does something similar, right? So in the time before Lent or leading up to Lent, and particularly you might think of Mardi Gras or Fat Tuesday here as being an example, there's a lot of partying and celebration going on throughout this period. Sometimes it is called Carnival, or just carnival time. And I will be doing some lectures on Mikhail Bakhtin, a great literary scholar who wrote significantly about Carnival. So if we come back to the play here, as a play, the Twelfth Night offers a lot of different roles for many different actors to shine. I think that's one of the reasons why it's been a popular play, because it gives a lot of stage time to a variety of different actors in different positions. So it's and those many of the characters are going through some kind of a reversal, and this is mimicking the celebration time of Epiphany Tide. It's significant that early reviews often seem to focus on the deceptive plot with the character Malvolio. As the name kind of suggests, mal, like malcontent, mal is bad in French. Malvolio is placed in a situation of reversal that would have been familiar from carnival festivals that take place during Epiphany Tide. One of the most famous being Mardi Gras, I already said, or Fat Tuesday, which is a feast before the beginning of Lent, which for Christians, of course, is fasting and renunciation. Lent ends with the coming of Easter. Various Christian celebrations of Carnival dealt with reversals of social position. Again, king for a day, where the fool becomes the king. This is a repeated theme with variations in pagan cultures as well. And that's one of the reasons why the Puritans, Christians, wanted to push away from it, was because they associated such festivals with paganism. There's little in the play itself that refers to the title, though. And this is something that, I mean, so here I am talking about all of this historical context. This suggests that the title refers to the occasion of the presentation, that it was just a normal, maybe first put on during a 12th night celebration. Shakespeare adds a second title, or what you will. But that kind of pushes to the theme of the play of being playful, of being carnivalesque. It's just like anything goes, basically. So as the editors of the Art and Shakespeare edition note, the audience becomes a co-protagonist with the play. We are being asked things as an audience when we are implicated in the play. We are implicated in some of the harshness in which characters get treated. And so we are put into, as viewers, the place of judge for, like, when has the joke gone too far? The play doesn't answer that itself, but it implicates us in our laughing, and makes us think about what role we might have. In this sense, it could also have hearkenings back to morality plays, which come from medieval Europe and are often put on in the front of churches or on the steps of churches. That's where early stages sort of came from. And there's an ongoing back and forth about drama and stage acting and whether or not it's acceptable for Christians. Think about it just as any kind of controversy over religious representation that we see today. We mostly hear about it in terms of conservative Muslims or artists or who've depicted the Prophet Muhammad, such as what happened with the Charlie Hebdo affair. So representation and religion, if we cast this back into the Protestant Reformation, there was with it a movement towards iconoclasm. So Protestant Christians were going into churches, toppling statues, breaking stained glass windows, scratching out the eyes and the faces of saints that were painted on the walls, because it was a religious extremist movement, right? And so they wanted to clean up and to purify in some sort of way their theology. Also, there was a lot of reading the Bible and editing the Bible. So there's the Apocrypha, right, which Catholics use as part of their Bible, but that Protestants have a shorter or redacted version of the Bible. All of that's going on during this period. So the play asks us, like I said, to consider when a joke has gone too far. There's constant shifting of perspectives in the play. We look at the character names, Olivia, Viola, and Malvolio, whose letters in their names are close anagrams, with Mal doubling as kind of bad. Viola, perhaps our main character here, cross-dresses as Cesario, and says at first that she is going to portray herself as a eunuch, so as somebody who is a man but's had his genitals removed, right? But that doesn't. That sort of goes away, that theme of the eunuch, because there's this romance that's developing as well. So there's a lot of gender crossing going back and forth throughout the play. We also see the characters, particularly Viola / Cesario and Fest, who are going in between their different social groups. So Cesario is the servant of the Duke, who is in love with Olivia and is the messenger. So we can think in terms of Greek and Roman deities and characters. So this would be Hermes going back and forth, or Mercury is the Roman name, right? So there's some of that element going on, and it gets gendered as well. Fest oftentimes ventriloquizes, and so makes up fake voices and acts as other personalities. Psychoanalytic theorists of literature have noted that, psychologically speaking, Viola's adoption of her supposed dead brother's identity keeps him alive. So we know from the outset of the play that there's been a shipwreck, that Viola has been separated from her brother Sebastian, and that she takes on a male disguise to be a servant for a duke in the land of Illyria. So some psychoanalysts have said that what she's doing by adopting the persona of her of a man is that she's in some way keeping her brother alive in her heart. Elam notes that Viola slash Cesario is also is rhetorically a blank, which is a space into which others project their desires and their own identity anxieties. As I've already said, there's major gender and age ambiguity going on, and the play actively moves away from that eunuch claim that it starts out with. There's a lot of self-mirroring or narcissism going on as a theme in the play. I want to think about mirrors when somebody's looking at their identity and separating it. This is a theme throughout Shakespeare's plays as well. Jonathan Bate argues that Viola becomes Echo instead of Narcissus. So these are characters from Ovid, the Roman poet, who wrote down a lot of mythological stories in his Metamorphosis and in a couple of other big poems of the early Roman period. So these Shakespeare's drawing on classical sources all of the time, and some of you might know the story of Narcissus, it's a story of how the flower of the Narcissus comes into being. Narcissus is a being who falls in love with his own image, look in the reflection of the water, and eventually gets stuck there and transitions into a flower that we call the Narcissus. Echo is another story of like someone who's in love and who just becomes an echo, calling out a name. So we might consider this character with contemporary notions of trans and non-binary genders, but also with the riskiness of declaring oneself trans or non-binary. I'm always encouraging my students to think about what literary criticism does. We're responding to our moment now. Yes, we are reading a play from the early 1600s, and we want to have cultural, historical context for there. But the purpose of criticism and why we keep watching and reading these plays is to find a way to make meaning in our own moments. So what might we do if we were giving a non-binary or a transgender reading to the play itself? If you don't know this, during Shakespeare's time, all actors on stage would be male, or would be, yes, and gendered masculine, right, for the time period. So there's a lot of playing with cross-dressing already going on in the comedies of the 1590s. This one seems to push the boundaries, and it seemed to especially push the buttons of Puritan folks in its overt sexuality sometimes. So of course we have on the stage, we have homosexual encounters happening. Everybody in the audience knows that it's men playing women, that when they kiss, when they do anything homoerotic, that it's charged in a certain way. Um, a good thinker on this is Catherine Bond Stockton, who I was fortunate enough to be in seminar with and a mini seminar with back in 2011 at the School of Criticism and Theory at Cornell. She has a theory of the queer child, where she says that because people were not allowed in official realms, especially she's talking about 20th century culture, um, that what happens when people can't grow up in the vertical metaphors that heteronormative culture has, set characters grow sideways. And so this is something that we might think about with characters in the play, taking someone like Catherine Bond Stockton's theories about queerness and childhood, because we know that Viola / Cesario is being referred to in the play as right on the cusp of childhood and adulthood. So there's something queer about and unlocatable about how she's presented in the text itself. With narcissism, or the theme of Narcissus, there's also the moral blindness or social blindness that comes with being narcissist. Music is a big theme in the play, and there's a lot going on that if you look in the back of the Arden edition, you will see actual songs written out. There is in Act 1, Scene 2, line 14, there is a reference to a classical image of Arion riding a dolphin. This comes right out of Ovid's Fasti, which is another big poem, the Metamorphosis I've already mentioned. But there's also, this seems to be a reference to February in the Roman calendar as well. So again, that's pushing for when the time of year was when this play Twelfth Night would be performed. Elam says that Twelfth Night is Shakespeare's most materialistic play. So we want to pay attention to clothes, to dress, to precious objects. If you're writing a paper for a class, you might pick one of those themes as something to track throughout the play. Drinking, letters, sex. There were dress codes in place to distinguish social class at the time. And so even the characters on stage are already pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable by maybe having an actor who's from a lower social position portray a king or something like that, right? So what is able to happen on stage really does allow for a kind of expressive freedom during Shakespeare's time that we might just take for granted today. The cross-dressing was overtly transgressive, even though some scholars might debate and say like, well, it's not as transgressive as we might think of it, because it's the norm at the time. Women weren't allowed to act on stage, and so men dressing up as women is no big deal. Other scholars have said that this particular play and some of the actors who play it are overtly sexual. So one way of pointing at this is the name Sebastian, or Saint Sebastian, who's considered, so Sebastian, of course, is the name of Viola's twin, right? Her twin brother, who shows up later in the play. That Saint Sebastian was considered to be a very beautiful youth, and that in paintings of Saint Sebastian, there's a pushing towards that kind of gender fluidity as well, as with the character of Viola as here. Along with the cross-dressing, there's the crossing of social classes that the play does. Remember, Fest can move around into lots of different positions, but we see Sir Andrew, who is a carpet knight. I mentioned this earlier. So he's bought his title through market success. He's like the nouveau riche, or the newly rich. And but he wants to portray himself as having aristocratic nobility and being brave and having sort of a courtly love and that might be from an earlier time. So, in a way, Shakespeare's play, and a lot of his plays do, is really makes fun of chivalry and courtly love, which was associated with earlier poetry that would have been considered passe during his time. There's definitely overt homoeroticism throughout the play. Even if one, I should say one there in my notes, even if one reads Viola as stably cisgendered in our 21st century terms, which means that, of course, that she identifies with her what she's sexually assigned at birth. She identifies in terms of her gender performance and sexual orientation in this case. Even if ultimately we know that Viola is a woman who is in love with a man and that they get together at the end of the play. So the play affirms a kind of heteronormativity beneath. Elam says perhaps the major activity in the play is the reading or the misreading of the body, turning it into a kind of text. So we know that the Duke, for example, is not, or seen is not aware. And so everything that he feels for Cesario in the play is directly homoerotic, right? And different stagings and different directors will play just how far they go, whether or not they're kissing on stage or not, as a way of actively portraying that homoeroticism. We want to be careful maybe a little bit about reading too much about our current cultural wars in the United States and categories of whether or not homosexual activity was okay or not. There is a lot more fluidity, it does seem like, in Shakespeare's culture. And so that might be something that you might dig into if you are doing more scholarly work on the play itself. So, and then at the same time, we might think about our current terms like cisgender and reading that back, or trans categories, non-binary categories, and what happens when we read the play from that perspective. Just as earlier in the 21st century, or then the late 20th century, a lot of feminist readings arose for the text, reconsiderations of Ophelia, for example, and Hamlet. I should, as I see that it might not be obvious to my students that this is a dark play, a dark comedy. So themes of death show up throughout the play. Famously, Shakespeare had lost his son, Hamnet, and that grief seems to be showing up in Hamlet as well. There is a theme of the hunt of love. So the referral of the referencing of someone who's in love with someone else as being a hunter, and the love object is hunted. This is a theme throughout Renaissance and late medieval or early modern poetry. And so Shakespeare is definitely hinting at that, but remember, he's also making fun of the courtly love or chivalry tradition as well. He often does this with allusions to Ovid's metamorphosis, or to stories such as Actaeon, who, gaze falls upon a goddess, and then Diana or Artemis, and who then sicks his own dogs on him and has him torn apart. So the gaze, the looking on of another body, and where transgression occurs. It's all stuff to think about here. I will say more about this in another lecture, but there is very much, we need to be attentive to a contrast between verse and prose in the piece. And I think that a lot of my first year or second year university students maybe do not see this right away. It's what these contextualized readings are for. So we want to think about when verse is metered out, usually in iambic pentameter, and when Shakespeare turns to prose. He does that to signal the level of class that or social positioning that a character might have. Elam tells us that prose is the medium of idiomatic realism. It's used in the, quote, low scenes between Toby and his cronies. Verse, then, is the medium of Shakespeare's inventiveness. It's actively poetic. It knows itself to be poetic. It's used by the upper class characters, as we will see in the opening, where there's a contemplation about art itself, and art not just being painting or music, but all of the arts. And what do we do as makers? Homo faber is the Latin term, man the maker, right? What do we as a species do when we create our own world? This is actively what's going on with the aesthetic themes of the Renaissance or the rebirth, right? It's called rebirth because artists in Italy and then later up in England, spreading throughout Western Europe, there is a rediscovery of the ancients, of the classics of pre-Christian cultures, and that makes its way into the art and the expression of the Renaissance. And so they're rebirthing and refining out approaches to art, and that they're displaying this on stage. That's part of Shakespeare's moment. So verse is the medium of Shakespeare's inventiveness. There's a lot of idiomatic use and code meshing going on throughout the play. So when lower class characters say things like tut tut or go to or I say, versus an influx of bigger, longer words that you might not know the meanings of, Shakespeare's playing in his time with an influx of Latin and Greek words into the English language. He's pushing the boundaries. A lot of his audience members are going to be lawyers, but there will be people of lower classes as well. So there will be royalty in the audience. There will be a lot of clerks, people who are becoming lawyers. So there's a lot of law students. So there's a lot of legal language showing up and jokes that are being made among law students during his time. Want to notice how French appears in the play. When French words show up, there's a lot of punning going on. French was considered a higher or more noble language than English, but English writers who were trying to point to the sophistication that the language of England could be, or the English language could be, are competing with and trying to be just as sophisticated. So a lot of the big words and things that show up in Shakespeare plays are very self-consciously being used by playwrights like Shakespeare at the time to comment on the place of English culture and English language in relation to broader movements and aesthetic movements going on the European continent. Another thing to notice for people who have not studied much of the English language today is the use of thou versus your. In English, we have contemporary English, we have generally given up thou, which is the intimate form, and we use you or the second person almost all the time. We can still hear it, especially if you're a native English speaker, we can still hear thou. Or I don't give, if I'm giving something to someone else, I give a book to thee, not to thou, right? I give it to thee because it's in the dative case, which is about gifts and objects that are being transferred. If I say you, thou, if I say your, I don't say thou book, I say thy book, right? We can still hear that. What's interesting for us is that the thou and the thee and the thy, these are forms of intimacy, just like in French or Spanish. In French, for example, you have a difference between tu and vous. The tu is familiar. The tu is the earlier form of thou that we used to have in English, but we moved away from that close proximity and intimacy. And there are lots of sociolinguistic speculations on why that has happened in our language. But when we look back at the text, generally you can just substitute in your mind you and your for thou and thy, for example, as you're reading the text, but you also want to pay attention to when characters use that thou or thy and with whom they're using it. Because, for example, Sir Toby is using it to demean others when he uses the thou. He's just saying that they are lesser than. A king or royalty would use thou with subjects, but a subject would not use thou with a king or with their social superior. And so Sir Toby is putting on airs and making himself seem more noble than others. And it can be very, very offensive. And it's used intentionally to offend characters in the play. So we also want to note that Cesario always uses the formal deference with Duke Orsino. So always uses formalness, doesn't use thou and thy. And that masks Viola's love for him and desire, and she wants to be his servant. So that's another sort of theme: bondage and discipline. Yes, you can go there, right? With this, that her love shows up in wanting to be his servant actively, and putting herself in a submissive position. At the same time, as Elam notes, and this is for those of us who are interested in rhetoric, that's what my English PhD was in, we want to think about hyperbole, right, which is a fancy rhetorical term for exaggeration. What we see in the play, for example, is that Cesario will use exaggeration of deference to Olivia because Viola / Cesario is acting as Duke Orsino's servant in the play. Duke Orsino tells Cesario to go and give love messages to this other woman, Olivia. Cesario's in love with Duke Orsino at the same time. And so this is kind of heart-wrenching for Cesario. And at the same time, Olivia falls in love with Cesario. And so Cesario's in this impossible position, whereas Elam said earlier, the position of being a blank, right? Olivia's casting desires onto Cesario for Cesario, and Duke Orsino is using Cesario to convey his desires for Olivia, all the while there's a kind of repression of whatever desires that Cesario himself / Olivia, Viola herself might be having at the time. And we, the audience, are put in a position where we know what's going on. We can see more than what the actors or the characters know on stage. That's the definition, basic definition of dramatic irony, when we in the audience know more than the characters on stage. Hyperbole, just to come back to that device that's being used in exaggeration, is that Cesario knows that Cesario can't be demeaning to Olivia and to Olivia's advances. So what she does is what he does. I'll use he for Cesario. Even though it's Viola, right? So it's the she/he thing. Gender pronouns, right? The very interesting topic to be taking from our situation now and plugging back into the play. So Cesario uses exaggeration of deference to Olivia, both reluctantly to play the role of Orsino's servant charged with sending his love messages, and to maintain a kind of distance from Olivia and her sexual advances towards Cesario. So sometimes Cesario will overly flatter or magnify the performance of what a great and noble lady she is, but takes it to the extreme of exaggeration in order to create a kind of distance. So we want to pay attention to the ability that Shakespeare has to create all sorts of nuances in social positioning and gender crossing, and to convey other themes with that. I'm going to stop here. If you go on reading the introduction to the book, that from this point on, it just becomes about staging and stage direction, history of stage direction and sets and costumes and things like that, that I think are really important, but they're not important for these contextualized reading lectures. So feel free, if you haven't already started reading the play itself. I hope that this helps you just sort of get a background for the context and what's going on during Shakespeare's time. Thanks for watching, and we will pick up with another video shortly. Have a great day or night or morning, wherever and whenever you are.